So our first talk after lunch will be presented by Professor Claudia Wagner Riddle and Agustin Olivo from School of Environmental Science. Claudia is a professor in soil science and was just recently named Stephen Jaruzelski Professor of Climate Smart Soil Science. Did I get that right? But this is a very big deal. It's a tremendous coup for the university and a real nod to Claudia and her research team's outstanding accomplishments in soil science in particular, and also more broadly in environmental science and sustainability. And that's what I've asked she and Agustin to talk about, is some of their work specific to the dairy industry around pathways to reducing our industry's greenhouse gas footprint, how to calculate that, how to make progress, and how research can help achieve those goals for our industry and for our country. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Claudia and Agustin.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction, and nice to see so many people here at this meeting. You all had your ice cream, but also hopefully some coffee. I'm going to start off with giving you context for the research that we do, and then give you a very brief overview of current projects. And then I'll pass it over to Agustin, a postdoc in my group, who's going to tell you about some results of his analysis. So with that, as we probably all know, dairy systems are sources of greenhouse gases that are in the three main forms: methane, nitrous oxide, and CO2. And those come from various sources on the dairy farm. So starting on your left here, you're all animal scientists, so you know this well, the enteric fermentation producing methane. Then we have the excreta, manure stored either in the housing or in manure piles and storage systems outdoors. Depending on the mix of liquid to solid, you may have some N2O with the solid manure, but mostly for dairy systems it's in methane form. Then we also have energy, fossil fuel use on farm, which produces CO2. And finally, on your right there, the feed production. So when I know you mostly think about cows, but we as environmental scientists think about the whole system and the opportunities to reduce emissions along the way. As we get to the field component, you have the only arrow going in, which is the CO2 that gets taken up by plants, and that a portion can be stored in soil as soil carbon. But then there's also the arrow leaving, which is when you have some material decomposing, as well as nitrous oxide, which is influenced by nitrogen management. So these are Dairy Farmers of Canada numbers that give sort of the magnitude of the sources that I just showed you in the previous slide. So the top one is the enteric fermentation, which is under livestock management, the blue part of the chart. Then we have feed production. So this is why I think we have somebody like me talking to this audience, because what you do in terms of feed production affects the carbon footprint. So now I'm pointing out that this is emission per kilogram of milk. So the productivity also impacts it because that's in the denominator. So I think the last and only time I spoke to this audience was just before the pandemic, when we talked about this work on where we used ODFAP data, which I think all of you know what that means. So that about 200 data from 200 farms to calculate the carbon footprint of milk and then relate it to the dairy, to the profit. And what you see is an inverse relationship. So if you have a lot of profit on the farm, your carbon footprint is also going to be smaller. That's because you're more efficient, and the variables that affect that are listed here on the right. So increasing productivity for the same amount of emissions brings your carbon footprint down. So I heard this morning from Guy and so on that Ontario farmers had made a lot of money with this, or had a good year. So perhaps it also means the carbon footprint of milk in this year was a bit less, because the two things are related. So really we like to talk about this as a win-win, right? So you're improving the environment and you're still making money and keeping the farm viable. So now I'm going to switch gears a bit and talk about a couple of projects that are ongoing. So the first one is focused on this feed production part, and is part of Living Labs Ontario project. And we are very happy to be able to work on a commercial farm, and you can see our famous Janet sitting right there, show of hands, and she, who is the PhD student working on this. So we are really excited about this because it gives us data on a commercial and actual farm as opposed to in a research station. And the focus is on nitrogen use efficiency, both from the manure and the inorganic fertilizer. And it's, as part of Living Labs, it's this idea of co-developing. So we're going to applying best management practices that are of interest to the dairy community, dairy farm community. And in this case, we are fairly close to the main buildings, where with half of the field managed in corn, silage, in 2024, soybeans, and then it's going to go into alfalfa, and this side in perennial, like a longer alfalfa rotation. So the first thing that we have looked at is the use of this dual inhibitor. For those not familiar, like when you apply urea, UAN, you can put an additive on the fertilizer that will inhibit the microbes that are producing the nitrous oxide. In addition, we combine that with a 15% rate reduction. And just some preliminary results from 2024, I will show you in a minute, but this is all the instrumentation that we have out on the site. We have a shed with very expensive equipment sitting in, and then tubes going out in the field. And there's lots of coordination that happens with Ian and Janet in terms of removing the equipment for field operations. So this has all been a learning experience for all of us. For the first year results, we did see a 30% reduction with the use of that dual inhibitor, which by coincidence is the target that the federal government, a voluntary target that they have set for fertilizer-related emissions. I want to point out that perennial crops are not big emitters of nitrous oxide, so that's another thing that needs to be considered in this carbon footprint analysis, that a lot of the crops used in dairy farming are perennial, or at least for like 8 years or so. And more importantly, for interest to the farmers, is that the efficiency also increased because the yield was slightly higher, and then there was less N left in the soil in the co-developed BMP. Lots more to come on that project, but I want to move on to the second project that I just want to mention, which is the Dairy Farmers of Canada Cluster Project. That is focusing on all components, not just the feed production, but manure management and livestock management. So the lead on this is Andy Vanderzag from Ag Canada. I'm co-lead, and there are a number of universities involved, as well as Agriculture Canada. And it has 4 components. So starting with the animals, we have animal scientists obviously looking at the effect of 3-NOP, not just on the enteric fermentation, but on the manure component. The second part is adding additives to the manure to inhibit methane production, and Andy is the lead on that and includes both lab studies and on-farm studies. The third component is on the soil carbon sequestration and N2O emissions that the group from Quebec, from AFC Quebec and Laval is looking at. They have long-term plots, which are really important to quantify the carbon component. And then fourthly is putting that all together, because all these components are interrelated. So if you change the diet, you may change what happens in the manure, you may change what happens in the soil. If you change the feed combination to reduce N2O emission, that has upstream effects in terms of what's fed to the cows. As part of this project, I just want to show one slide, that is related to this acidification, so low dose acidification. We had shown, or Andy had shown, that in lab study or smaller scale studies that this was very effective, but we did not have any data at the farm scale. So as part of this project, as well as Living Labs, Andy has done these measurements on a auto area farm. This shows some of the equipment, and this is hydrogen sulfide added, but in low doses. And this is very exciting data. So the blue line shows you the baseline year where no acidification was done. The red line when they applied once, and the green where they applied twice. So there was an 86% emission reduction from applying the dose twice, and the cost basically with a $20 per ton of carbon pays off. So I'm very happy to share this with you, and lots more to come on that project. So with this brings me to the time when I hand it over to Agustin. The intention of this component, as I said, is modeling the interactions, but we started off with an analysis to indicate which practices are the most promising, and that's what Agustin has been working on.
Great. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks, Claudia, for the intro. Yeah, so basically, as Claudia mentioned, the idea with one of the components of this bigger project was to look at more from a theoretical perspective on like how far can we get in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions between now and 2030 and 2050. Again, from a theoretical perspective, running a series of scenarios that combine different BMPs, the most promising ones, and then different scenarios of farmer adoption of this practices. And this is the work that we're also doing in collaboration with a lot of people you see listed there from different institutions across the country. So we basically, our methodology of what we're doing, the study is not a full life cycle assessment, so we're not looking at 100% of the emissions, but we're looking at the three main ones as Claudia was describing. So basically feed production, enteric fermentation, and manure management. Like if you remember the graph is about 80 to 90% of the emissions from the farm. We're looking at emissions from the farm level. We're using 2025 as our baseline. We're only considering a series of practices that are well documented in the literature for their impact on greenhouse gas mitigation. And then we're mostly taking the methodology of the Canadian National Inventory Report for greenhouse gas emissions, the ones that Canada has to report to the IPCC and the international conventions. That's the methodology we're using. And then we are tapping into a series of additional sources of data to refine a few estimations to make it a little more dairy specific. So jumping into what practices we're considering for the feed production side of things, we're looking at 6 different practices. The first one is like an N nitrogen application refinement, basically looking at reducing fertilizer nitrogen application up to crop nitrogen requirement, basically. The BMP2 is maximizing manure nitrogen use, basically moving from fall apply manure to spring apply manure that we know will maximize plant availability of that nitrogen, and then we can further reduce inorganic fertilizer use. We also have a series of 4R practices that particularly target the inorganic nitrogen application, looking at refining and reducing emissions by utilizing ammonium-based fertilizer, injecting that fertilizer, potentially using variable rate and enhanced efficiency fertilizers, or the type of technology that Claudia was describing in Janet's farm that we were testing. And then the use of manure plus also nitrification inhibitors and other technology that some research has shown to reduce N2O. And then on the offset side, we're looking into reducing tillage basically as an opportunity to sequester carbon, and then planting trees also as another opportunity to sequester carbon and mitigate some of the rest of the farm greenhouse gases. On the enteric fermentation side of things, we're considering 4 different BMPs. 3 of them are nutritional BMPs, so basically additives, 3 NOP, nitrates, and dietary lipids, basically increasing the lipids in the diet. And then we're also looking, primarily based on research out of University of Guelph as well, looking at the opportunity of selecting for low methane emitting cows based on methane efficiency. Finally, the practices on the manure side, we split them between liquid manure and solid manure. For the liquid manure, we had to do, we mostly did like the implementation of a single practice per farm, so we had to do a little bit of a split. So we considered that, for example, a hypothetical scenario where large farms would implement anaerobic digesters, and then medium and small farms it would implement one out of the other 3 practices, either acidification, the one that Claudia was speaking about, solid liquid separation of manure, or the cap and flare system where we put a cover to the manure pits and then we burn the methane into CO2, and we use like a split based on what we consider will be most feasible and what will also result in largest reductions. And then for the solid manure, we consider composting basically. So jumping into some of the results. So first we'll start with the potential reductions on the feed production side of things. So basically in the y-axis, what we see, I just realized I'm using the arrow here, but you don't see it on the screen. So not very helpful. So in the vertical axis, we have the greenhouse gas emissions in kilotons of CO2 equivalent per year. So this will be the aggregated amount of emissions across all dairy cows and all dairy systems in Canada, right? So the green bars show the total emissions in 2025. That will be the first one, our baseline. The middle one will be in 2030. And then the farthest one on the right, it will be the emissions in 2050. And then the gray bars are the potential reductions with each of the BMPs that you see listed in the x-axis. So basically, based on the numbers you see on top, we see about a 6% reduction by 2030 with the practices and the assumptions that we made for this theoretical scenario analysis, and about a 31% reduction by 2050. With the most promising one being this BMP1, this N application refinement, just trying to target with our nitrogen application with manure and fertilizer right what the crop needs. And then BMP3, which is this idea of using this for our practices, right rate, right source, right timing, and I'm forgetting the right placement of nitrogen fertilizer. Those were the 2 most promising ones based on the series of assumptions we made for this exercise, right? Jumping into the methane, the same graph, greenhouse gas emissions in total in the vertical axis. The orange bars are emissions in 2025, 2030, and then 2050. If you look at the numbers on top of the graph, we see about a 5% reduction by 2030 and a 48% reduction by 2050. I forgot to mention that we run a series of different adoption scenarios. The results I'm showing here are the most ambitious scenario we run. We run a medium ambition scenario in terms of how many farmers will be adopting the practices, and we run a high adoption scenario. What I'm showing here is the high adoption, pre-ambitious. It's pretty much implemented some of these practices in about 90% of the cropland associated with dairy feed production, or implementing some of the methane reduction practices in about 90% of the cattle, roughly. There's a lot of caveats and differences by practices, but that's overall the context. So here we see that our largest reductions are considering the practice of feeding 3-NOP, the additive 3-NOP, and then the mitigation with basically genetics, selecting pretty aggressively for methane efficiency between now and 2050. And then finally for manure, same graph, now in blue 2025, 2030, and 2050. And we see about a 6% reduction by 2030 and about 58% reduction by 2050 under our high adoption scenario, with the most promising ones being digesters and the acidification, again, under our series of assumptions. The last slide, what happens if we bring all of this together? How far do we get in this theoretical scenario? So here we go. So in the y-axis, again, the total amount of emissions, all the dairy systems across Canada. In orange, we see emissions associated with enteric fermentation. In blue, manure treatment. In green, feed production. And then what I hadn't showed before, potential mitigation with reducing tillage in pink, and then with tree planting in yellow. So we see under our high adoption scenario, pre-ambitious, we see about a 6% reduction, the numbers on top of the graph, by 2030, and about a 54% reduction by 2050, and that's including potential offsets given by reduced tillage and tree planting, particularly intercropping, as we've tested it. So just to wrap up, we've seen that with like the medium and the high adoption scenarios, some preliminary results of this work. We're still working on refining some of our estimations, but we see about a 34 and 54% reduction with our medium and high adoption scenario by 2050. We have a few next steps that we want to do in this project, like considering the impact of cover cropping on sequestration, and then a series of uncertainty estimations, because we have a lot of assumptions in this type of work, as you may imagine. And then we're also, as Claudia was describing initially, this is like the component of this cluster project that is bringing everything together. And we're initially doing this type of analysis, but we're complementing this with other colleagues doing more like process-based modeling. We're using other types of model to also look at the interactions among these factors that this type of modeling that we're doing here sometimes doesn't quite allow us to do. And of course, this is, as I said, we're considering technologies that are pretty proven to reduce emissions. We know there's likely between now and 2050 be a lot of technological development that will highly likely help further reduce emissions. And one thing that has been like we came across through this project is the need for additional sources of data to really know what's happening out there in the farms, because that can help us refine some of these estimations and see how many of the farms are already implementing certain practices and how much more can be implemented to further reduce emissions. And finally, like a lot of the research we're conducting in this cluster 4 on actual experiments on the crop side, on the manure side, on the cow side would also probably further help us refine some of this mitigation factors. So, and with that, I think we can, I don't know if we have time for questions, but that's it. Thanks very much.